Well, good morning, everybody. Bear Jones, SP History, and this is the beginning of episode 2, the Malcolm X series. Yesterday in episode 1, we talked about the first dispensation of Malcolm X, his childhood and upbringing, and the tragedies that he experienced, specifically with regard to his mom and his dad, the anger and hostility that he channeled into a life of crime, putting him in prison, where he was converted into the Nation of Islam and into the Islamic faith. And pretty quickly after he was released from prison and met with Elijah Muhammad, the leader of Nation of Islam, began to translate that uh, anger and hostility uh, that he brought with him into a more productive venture, which was representing the Nation of Islam. And we talked briefly at the end about the relationship between Muhammad and Malcolm X, how Muhammad considered Malcolm X to be his seventh son, caused a little rift with his own kids. He was articulate, he was a great speaker, he was brilliant. People identified him as intellectual. And Elijah Muhammad saw in Malcolm X a perfect messenger for the nation. And when I say the nation, I mean the Nation of Islam. And he himself was elderly, a little sickly, couldn't travel around the country and keep the schedule and proclaim the message with as much gusto and energy and charisma as Malcolm X. So he saw in Malcolm X a perfect messenger for the nation and was willing to exploit that. And pretty quickly started leaning on him like he was going to be his successor. Now, what we're going to look at today is his full dive into dispensation two. And we kind of touched on it yesterday at the end, where after his conversion, he still is angry. He still is unforgiving. He still has vengeance on his mind towards the white man. He still hates the white man. He, all of these negative uh, impulses that he had left over from his childhood that previously had pushed him into crime was now going to push him into this black Muslim or black power movement. So he's going to channel it in a more productive way, but it's going to be coming from the same place. And you'll see what I mean. We're going to go through a bunch of his quotes today, stuff that he was saying in his speech that even got to the point where it was too much for Elijah Muhammad. It was too extreme for Elijah Muhammad. In other words, Malcolm X was more extreme in his position towards the white man, more extreme in his position towards violence and retribution and revenge and all that kind of thing than even Elijah Muhammad was. And this is where the FBI is going to take notice. The United States government's going to take notice. They've already been surveilling the Nation of Islam. They've already been surveilling Muhammad. They've watched the rise in recruitment, specifically from the American prison system with these young African American males who are all angry. And their fear is that the Nation of Islam, in contrast to the SCLC, Martin Luther King, which is raising up an army of nonviolent, uh, non-cooperators, right? These are folks that are willing to go to jail and they're not going to fight back. The Nation of Islam is, in their view, in the U.S. government's view, potentially raising up a paramilitary army that will fight back. All they need is the word. All they need is the word go from their leader. And what they're going to start to notice is that though Elijah Muhammad is not the leader that's going to ever say or call them to action in that regards, Malcolm X, if he ever becomes the leader, won't hesitate. And that's when they really sit up and take notice of this guy because he has the potential to, you know, they're it's like the Nation of Islam is this gigantic sleeper cell of all these angry black militants and their training. They're called the Fruit of Islam, which is the paramilitary arm of the Nation of Islam. It's all these young men. All they need is a call to action. All they need is a leader who says, let's go fight. Let's go to the city street. Let's take this to the city streets. Elijah Muhammad doesn't seem to be that man. But with the rise of Malcolm X, it appears that there is somebody in the nation who is that man. And remember now, it's all coming from that same place of anger and hostility and unforgiveness and retribution and revenge. This is pretty much the stereotype of Malcolm X that everybody is taught, dispensations 1 and 2. And the history books conveniently leave out dispensation 3, which is when he really became a threat. Because let's face it, when you're angry and you're calling for violence, there's a limit to your reach. There's a limit to the audience that you speak to. Most Americans aren't going to glom onto that message. They're going to be afraid of it. So you're going to have a lid on your leadership ability as far as how many people you can recruit into your group or your organization. But if you ever switch gears and you start preaching peace and brotherhood and unity, and you still are a black man advocating on behalf of the black man, the African American population, the community in your nation, your reach exponentially increases. And that's when you become a bigger threat. But I just think it's interesting how most history texts eliminate, like it never happened, dispensation 3, and just focus on Malcolm X's upbringing in his early days in the Nation of Islam and his angry days, so to speak, because it creates an impression amongst people that are learning that material that Malcolm X got what was coming to him, and that it was all inspired by intramural rivalries amongst the black civil rights groups. It had nothing to do with the U.S. government. That's a convenient little message, isn't it? So today we're smack dab in the middle of dispensation 2. All right, I won't rehash all of my sources. We went over those yesterday. I'll just quickly go through the slides here, and if you're interested, you can note the particular source that you might want to access on your own later. So here's Democracy Now!, Dave Garrow, the FBI expert, Claiborne Carson, the FBI files, Manning Parable, the second conversion of Malcolm X, which leads to the third dispensation. Very important book. Recommend that book. Garrett Felber, a book about what we'll get into later in this series, the city of Newark, New Jersey, mosque number 25. The Muslims, the black Muslims who conspired against one of their own brothers, Malcolm X, and then participated in his assassination and then in the subsequent cover-up and have been continuing to cover up ever since. Dr. John Fox, the FBI historian, and then this documentary series about the 4 men assassinated because they shared the common goal of peace. That's when they became threats to the American establishment, when they were talking peace. Interesting, isn't it? And the Ancillary Entertainment, which is Godfather of Harlem. Fantastic series. I'd say, based on what I've seen of it so far, which is over half of it, historically about 90% of it seems to be accurate. There are some parts where they take some liberties with it, but the main thrust and the events that are happening, the people that are involved, very accurate, very accurate. So it's a fantastic series. The relationship that's most interesting to me is the relationship between the Godfather, here played by Forrest Whitaker, and Malcolm X, whom I noticed halfway through the series, they changed out the actor. The actor who played Malcolm X in the first half of the series is not the same actor who played him in the second half of the series. I tend to like the first one better, but they're both good. They're both fantastic. And so recommend that series. All right, today what we want to look at is his message, because he is now, when we left off yesterday, he is in the Nation of Islam. He's traveling across the country, acting on Elijah Muhammad's instructions, taking the message of the Nation of Islam, taking the message of Elijah Muhammad across the country, converting as many people to Islam as possible, and exposing the country to the Nation of Islam. He's, in many ways, he's sort of the, Elijah Muhammad started this, but because of his physical limitations, there were limits to his reach and his outreach capabilities. But Malcolm X was tireless and fearless. He was young, he had a lot of intensity and passion and energy, and he's willing to go do all the work. And he's been given a platform now to say what's been in his heart for a long time. So this is where I say, we're entering dispensation 2, because he is now channeling that anger in a more productive way. At least he's not burglarizing. He's not on dope and drugs and finding himself locked up in prison. Now he's taking this message and he's rallying the Black community, especially the Black male community, young Black men. And just to give you some anecdotal feedback from others about his impact on the movement, start off with a quote by Professor James Small. Malcolm was the closest thing to a god walking the earth. He redeemed the racial integrity of African Americans. He gave us our human beingness back. Sanchez said the most important thing that Malcolm did is that he made us eradicate the fear that we walked in. To enslave people the way America enslaved us, they had to keep us afraid. Abdul Razak said, Malcolm taught us, he said, he isn't nothing but a white man. He isn't a tree. He isn't a mountain. He's just a white man. And if cut, he bleeds just like you. He has made an artificial world in which you will bow down to him. That day is over. So you can see in these 3 quotes the human element, as Professor James Small refers to, the fearlessness that Sonia Sanchez refers to, and the confrontational nature of Malcolm X's message, which Abdul Razak mentions. So this is a different kind of African American representative. He's not teaching his followers to turn the other cheek. He's not saying take the beating or take the water from the hose or the bites from the dogs. He's not saying let's go have a sit-in, or let's go have a sing-in, or let's go have a teach-in, or let's go march. The operative word that seems to come out of Malcolm X's mouth is always to fight. And it's not about deferred gratification. He's not willing to wait a long time for equal rights and justice, all these things. He wants it right now. So that implies, since white man is not willing to give up all these things right now, that the Black man is going to have to fight and take it. And that's his message. And maybe he doesn't say all those exact same words, but it's implied. You read between the lines, listen to his words, and you read his body language and watch the demeanor on his face as he speaks. And there's nothing passive about Malcolm X and or his message. There's nothing patient about Malcolm X and or his message. There's nothing deferential about Malcolm X and or his message. It's a very aggressive, take no prisoners, and the way the white man interpreted it, and a lot of Black folks as well, it was violent. And so this is his message. And of course, he always includes the phrase by any means necessary. This is to distinguish himself from Martin Luther King, who is not a by any means necessary, because violence would be included but in by any means necessary. Martin Luther King is not willing to entertain the notion of using violence. So there's a limit to what Martin Luther King, the SCLC, will support. But Malcolm X is saying, hey, whatever it takes. Ross Baraka, the mayor of Newark, New Jersey. By the way, this guy's just in the news last week. I don't know if anyone noticed, but I'm saying this on May 16th, and it was last week sometime. So it'd been like May 9th, 10th, 11th, somewhere in there. The ICE facility in Newark, where they were rounding up illegal immigrants. Ross Baraka led a group of Democrat congressmen, senators, and they stormed the facility to try to interrupt what ICE was up to. And Ross Baraka ended up, they wouldn't leave. So he had to be arrested. And it was a big publicity stunt and all that. So he's been all over the news here recently. He's conveniently or coincidentally running for governor of New Jersey at the same time. So this was a ploy on his part to gain stature within his state. But anyway, he said, quote, Malcolm was like the guy that took on the bully, in the school. He was the guy that would say what needed to be said, whether you liked it or not. Louis Omar, who was former assistant minister to Malcolm X, said, quote, his message made men out of boys. That's really what happened. It's interesting, in some of these video clips where you juxtapose the message next to of Malcolm X next to the message of Martin Luther King, you can really see the clear line of delineation or distinction between the two. And when Louis Omar says he made men out of boys, it's the fact that he was willing to call them out and challenge them to fight for what they wanted and not to accept or wait or defer to the white man to give it to them, but to take it, to fight for it. I think that's what Louis Omar is saying. When you're a boy, you go around with your hand out waiting for someone to give you something because you're dependent, right? When you're a man, you go make things happen. You take what you need or what you want. And this is their way of critiquing Martin Luther King, whom they believe is raising up a bunch of beggars, in support of Malcolm X, whom they believe is raising up an army of people that are going to take what they want and not wait around for the white man to feel generous. And I think when he says he made men out of boys, I think that's what he's speaking to, because you can hear it in all their comments about Martin Luther King in the early days. And you can hear it in Malcolm X and the criticism. We'll talk later about his criticism of Malcolm or Martin Luther King. And it's just, his voice just drips with disdain. His words are just scornful towards Martin Luther King, calls him the house Negro. You listen to Malcolm X, he distinguishes between the house Negro and the field Negro. He says the house Negro is the one who grew up, he's in the plantation house. And because he's in the house, he dresses well, he's taught certain level of etiquette by his master, and his master depends on him to run that house. And so there's a certain level of relationship there between he and his master where they both need each other. And indeed, Malcolm X says that the house Negro even came to the point where he loved his master because he was treated well. The field Negroes didn't dress well, wasn't taught anything except how to work, and felt this sting of a whip all the time and worked out in the hot sun. And nobody, he didn't eat at the master's table or in the master's kitchen. He didn't get the good food. And so if there was ever a fire in the master's house, The house Negro would save the master's life. The field Negro would be out there praying that the wind would increase and burn the house down faster. So in Malcolm X's world, all Negroes are not created equal. There's the house Negro and there's the field Negro. And he compared himself to the field Negro and Martin Luther King to the house Negro. And that's another way of calling somebody in the Black community an Uncle Tom. And that is not a compliment. To be called an Uncle Tom or a house Negro is not a compliment. And that is what Malcolm X publicly said about Martin Luther King. We'll get to it. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but again, continuing on with this by any means necessary theme, Malcolm X said once in a speech, quote, the man, and of course we're all talking about the white man here, taught you to hate your hair. He taught you to hate your nose. He taught you to hate your mouth. He taught you to hate your skin. The white man is the greatest hate teacher that ever walked the earth. And he was saying this in a speech in response to the white community or the white press labeling him an apostle of hate. He said, who's the hater here? You know, another time he said, quote, they call Elijah Muhammad a black supremacist because he teaches you and me not only that we're as good as the white man, but better than the white man. Why, your skin looks like gold beside his skin. This is what these folks that I quoted in the first slide are saying, is that he gave us our human beingness back. He gave us pride in being black. He made us proud to be black again. He didn't run away or shirk or act ashamed or put his head down, act less than, none of that. He was proud to be a black man. He was proud to represent the black community, and he wanted his listeners to be proud. And of course, this is a message the white community is not used to hearing from anybody in the black community. Malcolm X said, quote, it's the white man. He don't have to worry about us integrating with him. We don't want to be around that old pale thing. This was a statement in critique of Martin Luther King's desire to integrate the black community within the larger white community. And Malcolm X advocated separation. He said, we don't want to integrate. Screw that. Why do we want to integrate with the white community? They're the ones that have mistreated us all these years. We want complete and total separation. We want our own communities. We want our own shopping centers, our own malls, our own banks, our own grocery stores. We want our own restaurants. We want our own communities. We want separation. He says, I'm telling the truth just like it is. You don't see Muslims accused of brutality. It's the white man that's lynching people. It's the white man that's cracking skulls. It's the white man that's been heaping violence upon top of violence on the Negro. So you can see it's pretty clear that Malcolm X's inner turmoil that we've discussed that began when he was this little boy, he continued on through his teenage years, turned into a life of crime, from which he was rescued by the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad, is now being channeled into words. It's all still there, right? It's all still there. He hasn't dealt with the anger in his own heart yet. That hasn't happened yet. Kind of reminds me of somebody in my family that she's been divorced from her first husband now for 25 years. And subsequent to that, married a second guy and divorced him as well. Now she's single, and this is 25 years. She never talks about husband number two. Boy, you get around her for any length of time, and she can't stop talking about husband number one. 25 years they've been divorced. And she still brings up all of the things that he did to her, allegedly. All the hurts, all of the, she's never gotten over it. That's why husband number two never had a chance. She's still stuck in relationship number one or marriage number one. And until she gets past all that anger in her own heart and forgives, or accepts forgiveness, whichever it takes, she's never going to have a successful relationship. And this was reminds me of Malcolm X. He's spewing all this rhetoric that, if you're a white person, you're probably not in this audience, and so you're just getting little little excerpts in a newspaper column, and the white press is only too happy to oblige by putting the expert excerpts that are the most violent, the most hateful, the most vengeful, the most extreme in the story. So if you're white America, you're getting the most extreme version of a pretty extreme guy. And so it's building up this stereotype of who Malcolm X is. And the white press is going to find it very convenient to begin using Malcolm X's words and Malcolm X's face as a representation of what the entire civil rights movement was about. And it's going to really hurt the cause, because Malcolm X is speaking from a place of anger. And it's not a very attractive message. Now, it is to certain ones in the Black community, because it resonates with them, the desire for revenge, and the desire to want to fight, be violent, and all that. But even the larger Black community, the ones that follow Martin Luther King, it doesn't resonate with them. So again, he is limiting his own outrage. He's limiting his own amount of influence, and in doing so, limiting also the Nation of Islam. And he is in danger of smearing the entire movement, civil rights movement. Though he's trying to help the Black community, he's actually hurting it, because he's losing the moral high ground that Martin Luther King worked so hard to try to get. And it's giving the government a very handy, convenient pretext to start cracking down on these civil rights groups. And he's playing right into the white man's hands, what he's doing. He doesn't even realize it. But again, this is a young Malcolm X who still hasn't figured out or had the second conversion experience and figured out how to succeed in what he's trying to do. He's sabotaging his own chance of success. He says, we declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary. There's nothing wrong with what he said. Everyone has the right to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected, to have rights, and as such, to be given that immediately, to qualify for that now, not later, not in some distant future, but now. But when he says we intend to bring all of this into existence by any means necessary, it just overshadows everything he said prior to that. 90% of what he is saying, I would agree with. And honestly, I don't think the fact that he wants to take a more aggressive approach than Martin Luther King does is that bad either. It's hard for me I've never been in his shoes, but I am trying to imagine in my mind, if I was in his shoes, I think I would probably cater more to what he says or his message than I would Martin Luther King's message. I'm not the kind of guy that wants to go get beaten up on a march. I'm not the kind of guy that wants to go get hosed down or bitten by dogs. I would have to be trained to do that. It's not my natural instinct. My natural instinct would be to put my fists up and go down swinging. He is appealing to me in my younger days when I would have acted out of my natural instinct. And he himself is in his younger days, and he is operating out of his natural instinct. So I completely understand it. I'm sympathetic to it. I just also realized that in that day and time in America, when you're talking about the society as a whole, it's not going to be a message that's going to appeal or comfort the majority of the people. It's going to scare them. It's going to cause them to be afraid. It's going to cause them to reject that message. And of course, it's going to be easily exploited and manipulated. And that's the point I'm trying to make. But the purpose he's serving is important. He's trying to raise up the Black community to stop being afraid. He says, you don't scare Negroes today with no badge or white skin or white sheet or white anything else. This is what that quote I gave you in the first slide. He said, the most important thing he did was teach us how to get past our fear. The white man used fear for so many years to keep us down. And Malcolm X is rising up, trying to buck up against that fear. So it's an important message. And this is why the FBI is starting to take notice of this guy. This is why the government is starting to turn their attention slightly from Elijah Muhammad to Malcolm X, because he's the real threat in the Nation of Islam, not Elijah Muhammad. Nevertheless, Malcolm X never lost sight early on in his days in the Nation of Islam of who was in charge. He was very deferential to Elijah Muhammad. Here you see a picture of him posing under the picture of Elijah Muhammad. In the 1950s, remember, he's been traveling around the country, sort of like a vagabond, messaging on behalf of Elijah Muhammad, gaining converts all the while. He finally settles in the early 50s in Philly. And try to find any, there's all kinds of speeches where Malcolm X is talking on YouTube. There's no shortage of footage of Malcolm X speaking. And he's always refers to Elijah Muhammad as the, quote, honorable Elijah Muhammad. Try to find an example where he doesn't. I've looked, I can't find any. He was extremely deferential. He was so deferential to Elijah Muhammad, though he was getting a lot of the attention. And it would have been very easy for him to want to climb out from Elijah Muhammad's shadow and take his place as leader of the Nation of Islam, which he was quickly, because all these converts were coming into the Nation of Islam because of him, not because of Elijah Muhammad necessarily. But he never did that. And in fact, Elijah Muhammad's own son said that Malcolm X was the perfect follower. He was just very loyal. It was one thing about Malcolm X that, if you're doing a personality profile of the guy, and I feel like I've been psychoanalyzing him since we started. He came from that terrible tragedy when he was a kid, what happened in his family. And a lot of the anger and hostility that we've been referring to comes from that period in his life. But somewhere in there, he learned to be loyal. And he lost his daddy and he lost his mom for all intents and purposes. And he got put in a strange family. And he went into this life of crime, ends up in prison. And he didn't have a family. They broke up the family, sent the kids in all these different directions. Mom's in an institution, dad's dead. Family was just dissolved and gone. And then the next time you see Malcolm X being part of something is when he joins the Nation of Islam. And the leader of the Nation of Islam was Elijah Muhammad. And he glommed on to Elijah Muhammad like he was the father he lost. And he was just extremely loyal to Elijah Muhammad. And it was authentic. It was real, which is why Muhammad reciprocated and took him under his wing and treated him as his seventh son. It was extraordinary, the relationship those two had. It wasn't competitive at all, at least not the beginning. Malcolm X knew his place. So it's interesting, the juxtaposition there where you have this guy fighting and taking a message of fight to his people, saying, don't wait to be recognized. Don't wait for the freedom and the equality and the justice. Don't wait for it to be given to you. Take it. And yet in his own personal relationship with Elijah Muhammad, where he could possibly take over the Nation of Islam and get impatient and want to be the head guy, he didn't do that. So on a personal level, he was willing to wait. He was willing to defer. He was willing to be the number two. But the message that he was speaking was sort of contrary to that, sort of a dichotomy there. Everywhere he goes, he's attracting new members. And so if you're Elijah Muhammad, you realize, my goodness, this guy is my ace in the hole. He is my number one draft choice. I can send my kids out and speak. They don't make a dent. If I send this guy out, not only does he attract big crowds and converts, but the media follows him around. And so one speech in Detroit gets amplified because it's in all the papers, it's on the radio, it's on TV. So he starts sending Malcolm X out. He goes to Detroit. These are all urban areas where the converts are going to be, right? Detroit, Boston, LA, Atlanta, Hartford, Connecticut, Philadelphia, et cetera, et cetera. And the reward for that, because in 5 years of the time between Malcolm X's release from prison and he gets his first assignment in Harlem, in those 5 years, as he's traveling around the country and then he's in Philadelphia, he helps recruit into the Nation of Islam 40,000 new converts. And across the country, there's now 49 temples. In other words, you can chart the rise and fall of the Nation of Islam. It really coincides with the rise and fall of Malcolm X. You can, the explosion on the scene, the Nation of Islam and the temples and the converts, all this activity coincides with Malcolm X's conversion, his travel around the country preaching the message on behalf of Elijah Muhammad. The two are tied together. So Elijah Muhammad rewards Malcolm X with an assignment to be the chief minister of Harlem's Temple Number 7, pictured here. This is like this is the plum assignment. If you're a minister in the Nation of Islam, is to be in Harlem, the center of it all, which isn't that far away from the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural awakening that's going to take place, and it comes from this place, Harlem, where all these African Americans live together. And you're going to see a revitalization of arts and music and all this cultural kind of stuff. And at the same time, religion, because this is where Malcolm X preaches. This is his temple, number 7, courtesy of the assignment given to him by Elijah Muhammad. Now, technically, Elijah Muhammad operates the Nation of Islam out of Chicago. So technically, headquarters are in Chicago. But the epicenter of the African American community in America has always been recognized as Harlem. So him being assigned to Harlem was not a coincidence. It wasn't an accident. Malcolm recognized, if you're a minister in the Nation of Islam, everybody knows that's where you want to end up. If you're rising through the ranks, that's the temple that you want, or the mosque that you want. Malcolm said, if, quote, for Mr. Muhammad's teachings really to resurrect American Black people, Islam obviously had to grow and grow very big. And nowhere in America was such a single temple potential available as in New York's 5 boroughs. He's talking about Harlem and New York City, generally speaking. So he understands why he's being sent there. And this is why the FBI starts taking notice. This guy has risen through the ranks so quickly, and he's the one with the following. Now, he's working on behalf of Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam. But the reason all these converts are flocking to the Nation of Islam is because of Malcolm X. And the FBI, which has been surveilling Elijah Muhammad and surveilling the Nation of Islam, takes note. Zahir Ali, who was a historian, said, quote, as Malcolm X rose in popularity, he began registering on the radar of the FBI. There was this intense fear and paranoia of what a singular, charismatic, influential Black leader could do if ever given the chance. All right, my title here is Black Messiah. These are not my words. This comes from an actual FBI memo authored by J. Edgar Hoover. In this period of the civil rights movement, there were all these splinter groups. You had the SCLC and Martin Luther King over here. You had the Black Panthers over there. You had Nation of Islam. You had all these different groups. And they didn't necessarily agree with each other. and their approach. They may have had all the same goals, end goals in mind, but they didn't agree on the tactics and the strategies. And they're always sniping at each other and being critical. And it divided the movement. And the FBI was keen on keeping it divided. This was the purpose of COINTELPRO, to exploit these differences, to manipulate these groups into fighting amongst each other, and then also to infiltrate and try to discredit them and their leaders. But if they ever come together as one, that's when the movement becomes really significant and dangerous to the white establishment. So it was, Hoover saw it as his responsibility to prevent a black messiah from rising up and coalescing all of these different movements under one banner. And it wasn't until, you know, you think about who was assassinated and at the hands of the FBI, or at the buttons were pushed by the FBI to help facilitate the assassination of these people. It wasn't until they transcended their own group and began, and there was potential for them to become that black messiah and become the leader of all the groups. And you see Fred Hampton, and he was very young when they killed him. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, all these, and of course, it wasn't until they began preaching a message of peace and unity and brotherhood and all this nonviolence. In Malcolm X's case, it wasn't until he reached his third dispensation where he had that second conversion, where he realized the anger and the bitterness was never going to work. And fighting fire with fire was probably not going to work. It was going to have to come through unity and brotherhood, et cetera, et cetera. That's when he became a threat. That's when he became the Black Messiah, potentially. Same thing with Martin Luther King when he launched the Poor People's March campaign against the Vietnam War. That included poor whites. All of a sudden, he's not just a civil rights figure. Now he's leading people, generally speaking, black and white. That's when he became the Black Messiah. And I don't think it's coincidental that's when they're both taken out. So, that was an obsession of J. Edgar Hoover to surveil these leaders in the black community. As long as they were preaching hate and violence, causing division, we'll keep an eye on them. We'll keep tabs on them. And we'll keep stirring that pot and contribute to that message because it works to our favor. But if he ever transcends that and starts bringing people from opposite groups into his group or under one banner, or reaching, or even worse, reaching across the racial barrier and appealing to whites, that's when we have to do something. We cannot allow a black messiah to rise up. So until they reach that status, we'll keep an eye on them. At which point that they potentially become a black messiah, we have to do something. Watching them is no longer good enough. I keep getting ahead of myself, but I just wanted to kind of lay the groundwork and show you when the FBI really starts to take notice of Malcolm X. Many saw Malcolm X as Elijah Muhammad's inevitable successor. Q. Amin Nathari said Elijah Muhammad was a brilliant spiritual man, but he wasn't a gifted orator. He didn't have the compelling delivery as Malcolm X did. He was also old and infirm. He didn't have the energy. So even if he had the speaking ability, he couldn't do it because he's too old and sickly, but he didn't have the speaking ability. So again, as I mentioned earlier, Elijah Muhammad saw in Malcolm X all the things he wasn't, but he was already succeeding to a degree as the leader of this nation of Islam because of his message. And but there were limits. But now with Malcolm X, he saw the opportunity to expand the horizons, influence the nation of Islam. He was going to take advantage of that. It was inevitable. Even if Malcolm X had not been assassinated at age 39, it was inevitable that he was going to outshine Elijah Muhammad at some point. And he was already doing it. He's barely been in it a couple of years. He's already doing it. Now he himself is not trying to outshine Elijah Muhammad. As we mentioned, he's very loyal, he's very deferential, but it's happening from the outside as they view the Nation of Islam. The FBI started to consider him the de facto leader, the one that could change the Nation of Islam from a kind of a passive organization to more of a militant organization. Even Martin Luther King took notice. When Malcolm got assigned to Harlem, he sent representatives from his SCLC to welcome Malcolm X and to recognize him as a co-laborer in the effort, trying to use extend an olive branch, even though they disagreed on tactics and strategies. Their messages weren't anywhere near the same. Their goals were, and so he's trying to extend an olive branch. Maybe that was Martin Luther King. That's who he was in essence. He was always looking to partner, collaborate, and work together. He was preaching unity and nonviolent, all this stuff. But Malcolm X didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to hear that message. He was not interested in working with Martin Luther King. In his view, at that point in his life, Martin Luther King was part of the problem. He called them the bourgeoisie nobodies who sold out to the white establishment. I told you the story about the house Negro and the field Negro. There is a speech you can watch on YouTube where Malcolm X goes into great length and great detail explaining the difference between a house Negro and a field Negro. And the implication is that Malcolm X is the field Negro and Martin Luther King is the house Negro. And flat out called him an Uncle Tom. So this is one of the things that you can fall prey to if you're not careful, is to lump all these people in the same category. So they're all working together. They weren't. Now, at some point they will, at least try to, but early on they weren't. When Martin Luther King spoke about nonviolence, Malcolm X responded, talked about self-defense. He would oftentimes begin his speeches saying, quote, "Those of you who think we are here to tell you to love the white man, you've come to the wrong place." And then here's the dig at Martin Luther King. He says, "Those of you who think that you perhaps came here to hear us to tell you to turn the other cheek to the brutality of the white man, I say again, you came to the wrong place. Go across town where Martin Luther King is speaking. You hear that message over there. That's not what you're going to hear from me." Martin Luther King dreamed of integrating within white society and achieving the equality and justice, social justice, while maintaining the system as it was and integrating inside white society. In other words, become part, assimilation, basically, is what it is. And Malcolm X was just the opposite. He preached political and economic separation. So you can kind of make a case that Martin Luther King was an integrationist, and Malcolm X, though black, was a segregationist. He didn't want to be integrated with the white man. Martin Luther King did. Malcolm X preached independence, complete and utter independence outside white society, proposing a complete break, racial separation, and a creation of an independent black state. That's revolution talk. That's revolutionary in its approach. He said, quote, "Martin Luther King is just the 20th century or modern Uncle Tom, who's doing the same thing today to keep Negroes defenseless in the face of attack that Uncle Tom did on the plantation to keep those Negroes defenseless. Nonviolence for the Negro is just another way of being defenseless." Now, again, I go back to my own personal instincts, my natural instincts. I have a very strong fight or flight impulse. If I feel threatened in any way, shape, or form, I'm going to either fight you or I'm going to flee. That's the natural instinct. I have to consciously think myself through those situations to not just respond according to my natural instincts. And that's happened with age and maturity. When I was young, I didn't even know that about myself. It just reacted that way. It was until years later that I started to learn that about myself. So imagine, and I didn't suffer anything compared to what African Americans suffered, especially the African American young men suffered, uh, like Malcolm X suffered growing up, and thousands of others. So if I felt that as strongly as I felt it in my uh, growing up as a white person in a country that, and when I grew up, I was in the 80s, so we're well past all these struggles of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But if I felt that, and it was that strong in me as a white young man, how much stronger would it be in the heart of a young black man? And this desire to not be defenseless. You know, you've heard that saying, if I'm going down swinging. That was like that was like my modus operandi as a young man. So I can completely sympathize or empathize, understand the natural impulse Malcolm X is speaking from to not want to lay down and get hosed by the fire hoses or bitten by the dogs or beaten with the billy clubs. I'm not going to lay there and just take it. I myself wouldn't have done that. So why would they? Why would we expect them to take it? And he is speaking to a, a bunch of other young men who feel the same way as he does. And it's sort of giving them license or liberty, the freedom to allow themselves to be themselves. And it's a freeing feeling when someone comes along and validates how you feel. And that's what he's doing. He's validating how he himself feels, but in doing so, he's validating how they feel as well. A good number of them, which is why all of a sudden there's 40,000 converts in the Nation of Islam. They were attracted to his message. But again, in the larger perspective, and something that he would realize later on, looking back, there's a limit to your influence when that is your message. It's too confrontational, it's too violent, it's too filled with hate and anger, and it's not going to achieve what you're hoping to achieve. It's what Gandhi taught the Indian people in their independence movement against the British. It's what Martin Luther King is trying to teach. But it's not a message. Martin Luther King's message is spiritual. You have to fight against your natural impulses to accept Martin Luther King's message. You have to resist the demons inside of you and consciously decide not to fight back. It's the harder path. Malcolm X's path is the easier path. Everybody wants to fight back, right? Akbar Muhammad, who was assistant minister to Malcolm X, said that the civil rights movement was just getting cranked up, but laying down, letting people spit on you and beat you and turn hoses on you, and you just be there nonviolent. It didn't appeal to Malcolm. He wanted something that had a little more bite to it. Malcolm X said himself, it's time to stop singing and start swinging. That's a cut right at Martin Luther King. He said, quote, the day of the sit-in, the crawl-in, the cry-in, the beg-in is outdated. I mean, he's just disdainful of Martin Luther King's message. By the way, I neglected to mention this earlier. As we proceed through this study, you'll notice in some cases, I will have to use two names for the same person because the Muslim tradition is to adopt a Muslim name. A lot of these folks, like, for example, Malcolm X, his original name was Malcolm Little. He changed it to Malcolm X, and Elijah Muhammad gave him the surname Shabazz. So If you're referring to Malcolm, you could say Little, X, or Shabazz. And the FBI or the media is not, especially in those days, was not always consistent how they identified these people. They'd sometimes identify them by their Muslim name, sometimes by their original given name. And that led to a lot of confusion. Even with, as I was studying it, sometimes I thought they were two different people. It wasn't, it was the same person. The FBI even ran into this issue when they were investigating people. They would investigate the given name and go and ask people about the person with the given name, and all the Muslims they were asking, or the black people they were asking, didn't know who they were talking about because they knew them by their Muslim name. And it was a way of hiding. So when we get to the actual investigation and stuff, assassination, I'm gonna have to use both names. So you'll see that as we go on. Now with Malcolm X, everybody knows who Malcolm X is, so I just call him Malcolm X. But if you see, as we proceed through this, me using two names to describe the same person, that's why. There's an English name, if you want to call it that, and then there's the Muslim name, but they're the same people. So here you see he's extremely critical of Martin Luther King. And I'm laying this groundwork because this is something that's very important to show early on during Dispensation 2, that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King are not on the same team. Martin Luther King would like to be on the same team. Malcolm X is having none of it. Now, when we get to Dispensation 3, that's going to change. And that's going to show a lot of growth in Malcolm X. And it's proof of that. It's a proof of concept. But you have to first show the backstory where he absolutely abhorred Martin Luther King's approach, made fun of it, ridiculed it. So you've got these two giants within the African American community, the civil rights movement. They're kind of pulling wagons in opposite directions. In the ghettos, Malcolm X is king. He is appealing to these young black men who are angry, just like he is. Martin Luther King's nonviolent, non-cooperation approach to achieving equality and becoming the spokesman for the civil rights movement, in contrast to Malcolm X's by any means necessary. Martin Luther King's trying to preach a more conciliatory approach, an integrated approach. Malcolm X is separating, segregated, right? Malcolm X appeals to the African American community inside the big cities, in the urban areas, the ghettos. Martin Luther King is appealing to the folks outside the big cities, in the rural areas, especially in the rural South, the folks that grew up in church. His organization is called the Southern Christian Leaders. He himself was a Baptist minister. These are folks that are raised in church. And you think about it, I think that's important. That's an important distinction, because Christians are taught that the greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others, you have them do unto you. So if you're a Christian minister, a Baptist minister, and you're preaching that, and that's your theology, then your movement has to look like that. So it's just natural for Martin Luther King to attract. A lot of folks, especially in the rural South, African Americans, went to church on Sundays. So he attracted that element. Malcolm X is from the streets. He's from the hood. And he's not as willing to turn the other cheek, and he's not bound by that Christian theology. The Muslim theology, which is sort of his baptism into theology in general, is more adversarial. It's more violent. So I think religion plays a part here in whom they're attracting. Malcolm X is attracting the hoodlums from the hood, right? The street-wise people from the ghetto. Martin Luther King is attracting the Christians who go to church, the Sunday morning crowd, a more genteel crowd. That's why Malcolm X can use that analogy of the house Negro and the field Negro. The field Negro is out there bloody, getting whipped, sweating, tears, working outside in the hot sun. Paying your dues, baby. And the house Negroes in the comfort of the house, sipping on lemonade, serving the master, always in the shade, dressed well, fed well, more learned in things such as literacy and etiquette, all these things because he's around the master all the time. The field Negroes are out there amongst the other field Negroes. That's their crowd. The house Negroes are around the white people. That's their crowd. So there's that dichotomy. And Malcolm didn't want any part of Martin Luther King's world. When you put it in those terms, he said, quote, the goal of Dr. Martin Luther King is to get Negroes to forgive the people who have brutalized them for 400 years by lulling them to sleep and making them forget what those white people have done to them. So it's pretty clear Malcolm X is not in the mood to forgive. This is, again, in his second dispensation. And I'm laying this groundwork because I want you to see just how dramatic of a change he's going to make after his second conversion. But you need to know what he was, where he's coming from. He didn't just criticize Martin Luther King, by the way. Malcolm X was a bomb thrower. We call him a flamethrower. I told you the story in episode 1 about me writing for my college newspaper and some of the dumb stuff I wrote. When you're young, you just say things, you think you know all the answers. You really don't know anything. And Malcolm X is thrashing around at this particular point in his life. And anyone who doesn't agree with him and his approach to achieving equality and justice, which is separation and using violence, take by any means necessary, whatever means it takes. Anybody that doesn't agree with him is to be criticized. So he goes after President Kennedy. He says, quote, as long as the dogs were biting Negro women, Negro babies, and Negro children, Kennedy said nothing. It was only after the Negroes began to strike back. And, he has a point that Kennedy was hesitant to get involved in the civil rights movement early on. And I discussed this in my JFK series about JFK and the journey that he was on. When he first became president, he was trying to keep the Democratic coalition together. The South was known at that time as the Solid South, all Democrat, all these old white men, stalwarts, former KKK members, segregationists. And here he is, a Northeastern liberal. He's got to keep them voting on his side. He can't come out in favor of civil rights and risk offending, especially during the primary process. He won't even get the opportunity to run for president. So he had to play a game to keep those white segregationists, former KKK members or Democrat Party members on his side. But, pretty soon after he becomes president, he's faced with having to protect the Freedom Riders, which he did. Then in 1962, he's faced with the prospect, the realization he's going to have to enforce the law, which said that schools are to be desegregated, they're to be integrated. And when Ole Miss wouldn't let James Meredith in, they were breaking the law. This is a result of the Supreme Court decision, 1954, right? Brown versus Board of Education. So he's president, he's the chief executive. His job is to enforce the law. So when he enforced the law, he took the side of the civil rights movement, James Meredith. And of course, all this is angering his base in the South. But somewhere along there, he becomes a true believer. And by the time we get to 1963, he's given that famous speech where he says civil rights is now the moral issue of our time. And he proposes what later becomes the 1964 Civil Rights Law, which was the most sweeping civil rights legislation in the history of our country. That's JFK. So he went from tenderfooting it to becoming a full-throated messenger of the civil rights movement. And that's the thing about JFK. In so many ways, he grew during his time, his short 1,000 days or 3 years as president. He grew. And instead of giving him credit for that growth, Malcolm X is criticizing for not acting soon enough. So by the way, this is going to color his reaction to President Kennedy's assassination as well. And it's going to eventually lead to the schism that splits Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. Because the larger Black community viewed President Kennedy very generously. They had a lot of respect for him. They gave him credit for the growth. Where Malcolm X didn't, they did. And what Elijah Muhammad's going to realize later is that Malcolm X and his criticism of Kennedy was risking to split the Black community even further, even more so than he was already doing with his very violent, hate-filled, anger, unforgiving approach and all the message that he was preaching around the country. It was just a bridge too far for Elijah Muhammad. The Kennedy bridge is the bridge too far. Now, there will be other factors that lead to the split, but what Malcolm X says in response to JFK's assassination was like the final nail in Malcolm X's coffin when it came to his participation and his involvement with the Nation of Islam. But we'll get to that. But you can kind of see where it's headed. He's not giving Kennedy the benefit of the doubt. Many Blacks were. Malcolm X wasn't. This is, if you're going to sum up Malcolm X's view of the white man, I think this quote sums it up pretty well. He says, quote, "The Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us that God now is about to establish his kingdom on this earth based upon brotherhood and peace." Incidentally, that is not the message that Malcolm's preaching. He didn't say anything about brotherhood and peace. So there's already a little daylight starting to show. The white man is against brotherhood and peace. Now, he's going to give an excuse why he doesn't believe in brotherhood and peace right here. He says, the white man is against brotherhood and peace. His history on this earth has proven that. Nowhere in history has he been brotherly toward anyone. The only time is when he can use you, when he can exploit you, when he can oppress you, when you will submit to him. Since his own history makes him unqualified to be an inhabitant or a citizen in a kingdom of brotherhood, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us that God will eliminate that particular race from this earth. So this is Malcolm X proclaiming the message of Elijah Muhammad and how, and justifying why they believe you can't expect the white man to participate in a future kingdom of brotherhood and unity because the white man doesn't believe in it. And so in order for this future kingdom to ever happen, the white man's going to have to be eliminated. And that's the message of Elijah Muhammad. Now, he's not advocating that they eliminate the white man. He says that God will eliminate that particular race from this earth. Malcolm, where he differs from Elijah Muhammad, is that he believes that they will be involved in that process. That waiting on God to do it is not God's will. God uses people to accomplish his will. And so this is sort of the beginning of Malcolm X's little separating of himself from Elijah Muhammad. Muhammad's more patient, willing to wait on God to achieve this future kingdom. Malcolm X is a little bit less patient and willing to be involved in that process himself. Even other African Americans who heard Malcolm X speak thought he was racist. Not all of them. Remember, he did appeal to a certain segment, especially in the urban areas, but especially Martin Luther King's followers who would go and hear him speak just to hear him speak in person after they'd been reading about him. They would go in here and they'd walk away shaking their heads. Some of them were scared. They thought, this guy's going to get us in trouble with the government, with the FBI. He's going to bring the FBI and U.S. government down on top of us because of the stuff he's saying. And so it wasn't just white America that's getting alarmed by the words coming from Malcolm X. It's also people within the Black community. And this becomes a very handy cudgel or leverage instrument for the white press, for the government to use against the civil rights movement as a whole, is to smear the whole civil rights movement with Malcolm X, this apostle of hate, this apostle of violence, to smear it all. You know, they didn't have anything to smear Martin Luther King with. They tried. J. Edgar Hoover's going to bug everything, surveil him, try to find weaknesses in his character, his personal integrity, finances, women, whatever. They they just didn't have what they needed to take away the moral high ground that Martin Luther King had established. But now, if we enter into the scene, Malcolm X and all this hate that he's preaching, and the fact that he's on camera all the time, he's in the newspapers being quoted all the time, he's out there, he's everywhere, and he's fearless in what he says. And this became very convenient to use to smear the entire civil rights movement. Let's put, instead of pictures of Martin Luther King and his march, including women and children, and them being victimized by the white police, instead of putting those pictures on the front page, let's put pictures of Malcolm X on the front page, raging in a speech. Let's put quotes in the article. All these anti-white, all this anti-white rhetoric. And all the work that Martin Luther King had done to try to create a movement that was appealing across racial boundaries, even to white people, especially up north, like Gandhi had done in India, was being swept aside in the thunder and lightning that was Malcolm X. And his words, his rhetoric, his actions, his facial expressions, his demeanor, everything. It was white America was putting Malcolm X's face and his words on the civil rights movement. And it was becoming, instead of a voice of peace, a voice of nonviolence, a voice of non-confrontation, a voice of being a victim, which has a certain amount of attractability. It gives you, it helps you win the sympathy factor, right? If your people are always getting abused, well, you see women and children getting beaten by white police officers, billy clubs, or dogs biting, or hoses being turned on them. There's a sympathy factor. It gives you the moral high ground. That's all being swept aside now. And now, instead of that conciliatory approach, you have a rebellious voice, angry, hostile. Let's take what's ours. And he's part of an organization that is mostly young and male, former prison population, that all feel the same way, and they're being trained, called the Fruits of Islam, and they're being trained as a paramilitary force. And they use words like black power. And they're segregating themselves from the white community. They have their own grocery stores, their own movie theaters, their own restaurants, their own banks. And the leader is advocating a complete separation, a segregation of the two societies. That's not what Martin Luther King is advocating. So, in order to just, again, this is part and parcel with what the FBI wanted through COINTELPRO, is to discredit the movement by discrediting the leaders. And when you weigh Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X, which one would be more advantageous for white America to smear or to discredit the movement? Clearly, Malcolm X is the easier of the two. Martin Luther King has proven to be pretty resilient. His movement continues to grow. Malcolm X's movement is the one they're going to glom onto to discredit the entire civil rights movement. And unfortunately, Malcolm X played along. His confrontational message that we will, quote, not stand by quietly for apartheid and tyranny to be exercised upon our people. It was constantly on the front page of newspapers, making headlines. He's being quoted on radio, on TV, and newspapers, and in white America, and even some people within Black America, Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam were becoming like the metaphors for a coming race war between white America and Black America. And this is why I say in the first and second dispensation, especially the second one, Malcolm X played right into the hands of the white man who wanted to discredit the very movement that Malcolm X thought he was working for. He was playing right along with them, not realizing it, but he was playing right along with their strategy. And so that's what I grew up learning about Malcolm X, because I was a white student growing up learning what the white press and the government, the white establishment wanted me to learn about Malcolm X. So that's what I learned. In 1959, on July 13th of 1959, a New York television station aired a 5-part documentary by Mike Wallace. Mike Wallace was one of the most famous TV personalities of that period. And the documentary was called, quote, "The Hate That Hate Produced." And it was all about the Black Muslim movement. And prominently featured in this documentary was Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X had to get permission from Elijah Muhammad to participate. And initially, Elijah Muhammad was resistant. He said, they're going to portray us in a terrible way. Malcolm X convinced him. He argued, hey, he said, this is necessary. We need to do this. And so, against his better judgment, Elijah Muhammad participated himself, as you can see the bottom picture there, and he allowed Malcolm X to participate. And you see the image that they used to promote the documentary, The Hate That Hate Produced. You see that image of Malcolm X. Without saying a word, you just look at the facial expression. It's pretty clear what this program is going to be about. No matter how reasonable his words might be, you just look at they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. You look at that picture, and if you're white America, you draw a conclusion about Malcolm X. Then you listen to his words. He says, quote, a study. Now, Wallace advertised this as a study of the rise of Black racism, of a call for Black supremacy among a small but growing segment of the American Negro population, and on Black supremacy. It wasn't about equality. Martin Luther King was saying, we just want to be equal. We want to integrate within the larger white community. Just treat us equal. Give us civil rights. That's a message that's palatable. That's a message that can, that has, there's a sympathetic nature to that. There's a moral high ground there when you're just asking to be treated the same as everybody else. It's the Christian thing to do. Treat everybody the same, right? As you would have yourself be treated. That it's Christian. But Malcolm X is advocating for Black supremacy. And that's what this program's about. And not, since the white man's never going to give you Black, we don't even have equality, much less Black supremacy, and they're never going to give us Black supremacy. We're going to take it. And of course, part of their message was that the white race would be extinguished by God. And the Black race would reign supreme at that point. It's a very confrontational message. And this was a TV program of some prominence in America during those days. And it had a very negative tone. I mean, you start off with that picture. That's the promo. And then you get into it, and Malcolm X starts opening his mouth. And though it had an attractive element to it that reached people in the ghettos, Malcolm X misunderstood, I think, and I think even he would admit it later, that he said, it seemed everywhere I went, telephones were ringing. And he misunderstood that to think, well, my message is growing, it's reaching more people, and it's achieving what I want it to achieve. And it wasn't. It was bringing more converts into the Nation of Islam, but they were of a certain ilk. They were hostile and angry themselves. And that's why they were attracted to a hostile, angry message from a hostile, angry messenger. But that didn't resonate in the white community. It didn't help the civil rights movement, because now the whole civil rights movement is being subsumed by this Malcolm X character and his message, which is separation, which is born out of anger and hostility and revenge. It's born out of this hatred for the white man. It's born out of a desire to see an extinction of the white race. You're not going to ever get the white man to sign on to that. Now, Martin Luther King's message was, we just want to integrate within the larger white community. We want equality. We want social justice. We want, to be part. We want to assimilate and be a part of the community, not separate from, not over, just a part of, equal to. Two different messages, two different messengers. One has the ability to attract white people to their cause and has the potential to become a movement that sweeps across the nation, because there's a moral high ground. It's Christian in nature. It comes from it has religious, every religion in the world basically has some measure of the golden rule in it, has some form of it. So it's attractive. It's an attractive message. Malcolm X's The Nation of Islam was not. And interestingly, Elijah Muhammad is going to start at some point realizing that his messenger is even more extreme than he is. And it's going to cause a division between the two of them. In 1960, Malcolm X established a newspaper called Muhammad Speaks. This is one thing he was very good at promoting. So this became the official Nation of Islam newspaper. And of course, that means that not only is Elijah Muhammad have another platform to proclaim his message, so does Malcolm X. Reader's Digest, Playboy magazine, all these white publications start clamoring for interviews, feature stories about the Nation of Islam and its top messenger, Malcolm X. During this period, the Nation of Islam also became involved in a series of successful business ventures. This became this was always part of Elijah Muhammad's message, is to separate from the white community and support black businesses instead of blacks buying from whites all the time and pouring all their hard-earned money into the white community. Why don't blacks support other blacks? Why don't we have our own banks? Why don't we, we go to a white bank and they turn us down for a loan because they don't want us to live in that white neighborhood? Why don't we have a black bank? Why are we always at the mercy of a white bank or a white company when we go to apply for a job, or white grocery stores? Why don't we have our own grocery stores, our own movie theaters, our own restaurants, our own business ventures? And this is keep our money in the black community. And so you start to see a rise during the late 50s, early 60s, and it coincides with Malcolm X and his willingness to go around the country and spread the message, and his ability as a speaker, his ability to resonate with these urban blacks who themselves were recently released from prison, just like he was. He had street cred with these people because he himself had been in prison. And so you see the converts flooding into the Nation of Islam. You see these urban areas establishing all these mosques, and they're starting to build these black business empires, enterprise zones, so to speak, where blacks are buying from other blacks. And it's all under the umbrella of the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad. But the guy who's really making all of it happen is Malcolm X. And then politics. This is where Malcolm X really begins to find himself at odds with Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, as we're going to learn, try to avoid the appearance of being nakedly political. And there's a reason for that. We'll get into that reason why, but they didn't want to be obvious in their politics. And they didn't want to be in your face about it. They had their beliefs. It was mainly born out of a religious belief, Islam, the Islamic faith. Remember, Elijah Muhammad considered himself to be the messenger of Allah. It's a religious designation. Everything he was preaching, everything his organization stood for, came from a place of religious teaching. He didn't want it to be political. But in 1960, Malcolm X found out when Fidel Castro came to New York to speak to the UN that the white upper Manhattan part of town didn't want Fidel Castro staying in their hotels. They didn't want to host him. And we've gone on and on about Fidel Castro in my JFK series. In 1960, after the revolution, and after his initial meeting with Richard Nixon, where he rebuffed Nixon and the Eisenhower administration, Fidel Castro became persona non grata. The only reason he's coming to New York is because he's invited there to speak at the UN. We didn't really have any jurisdiction over that. But he was public enemy number one as far as the Eisenhower administration, as far as Nixon was concerned. By 1960, we were already launching Operation 40. CIA was planning the Bay of Pigs. We were trying to assassinate him. I mean, this guy was not our friend. And he's already allied himself with the Soviet Union. He's a communist in our hemisphere. There was a lot of fear in American society that Fidel Castro was going to spread communism throughout Latin America. And when he came to America to speak in New York, there's this full-fledged flame-throwing communist who's standing up to the United States in New York, basically snubbing his nose at America. He was not a sympathetic figure as far as Americans were concerned. They were all caught up in the fear mongering that's coming from the American government about Fidel Castro and what he represented. And here is Malcolm X coming to his aid in the name of the Nation of Islam, but it's really instigated by Malcolm X to provide Fidel Castro with a place to stay. Okay, they won't let you stay in Manhattan. You can come down here to Hotel Teresa in Harlem. We'll put you up there. And the symbolism of this is, you cannot overstate the importance of this. It's one thing when Malcolm X is angering white America, talking about black supremacy, speaking about the elimination of the white race. It's one thing to alienate white America with your anger and hostility and the hate that is in your rhetoric, the violence that you espouse. It's a completely different thing when you are seen, at least in their view, to be allying yourself with public enemy number one. This would be like in today's age, allying yourself with Vladimir Putin. So many Americans have been, we've made a tradition in America, always having a boogeyman. And the press goes along with it, the history textbooks, the media, everybody, the government, Hollywood, they demonize somebody. It's like the word goes out, okay, the demon, the boogeyman of this age will be fill in the blank. And everybody jumps on board. And the American public goes along with it. Whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, they go along with it. In the 60s, it was Fidel Castro. And here is Malcolm X accommodating America's enemy, which puts him now in a new, he's now on an international stage. He's friends with our enemy. It's very easy now to label him as a traitor, committing treason. This takes it to a whole nother level. especially if you're the FBI or the CIA, because now this internal inconvenience is becoming an internal threat to our country because he's allied himself with our greatest perceived threat from outside. So this is a big moment right here. And there will be other big moments, but this is a big moment. This is Malcolm X basically saying, thumbing his nose at the establishment and allying himself with somebody else he considers to be a fighter and saying, just like you have been mistreated, just like we have been mistreated in America for all these years, I'm going to highlight the fact that you are now being mistreated, and we'll take care of each other. But this puts him on a Malcolm X rises to a new level of prominence as a result of that one act, taking in Fidel Castro at the Hotel Teresa. 1961, Elijah Muhammad, who had now moved to Phoenix, Arizona, away from the headquarters of Nation of Islam because of health reasons, made Malcolm X the national representative of the Nation of Islam. So this is essentially Muhammad saying that this guy's going to be my successor. I'm going to make it official. Everyone had already suspected as much, but this is now making it official. This creates resentment among Muhammad's inner circle, many of whom are his kids. We've already spoke to that. The fact that Muhammad treated Malcolm X so well all this time, called him his seventh son, all this stuff. The fact that he was elevated so quickly. You know, the Nation of Islam was not exempt from all the same human impulses that exist in every other organization in humanity, which is greed, envy, and jealousy. And they're going to fall prey to all these same symptoms, or all these same vices. And so there's some jealousy, some resentment among Muhammad's inner circle when he gets appointed or anointed as national representative for the Nation of Islam. I introduced that now for the second time just to start planting the seed of the internal strife that the FBI is going to capitalize on, exploit, manipulate to neutralize the threat that is this rapidly growing threat known as Malcolm X. He's being asked to come around the college circuit and lecture on college campuses. He's being asked to participate in live radio and television debates. In 1961, Malcolm X is everywhere. He's omnipresent. It's exhausting to look at his schedule and see how he lived, just traveling around, carrying the message, always in this fighting stance. It just had to be exhausting to be in form and be on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the way he was. But he was young. This is what Muhammad saw in him. He was young, full of energy, full of animosity, anger, hostility, and that can drive you to achieve a lot. You can get a lot done with those as your motivators. But the question is it effective? Is it efficient? Is it achieving what you think it's achieving? And in these first two episodes, what I've shared with you so far are the first two dispensations of Malcolm X, all coming from the same place of anger and hostility. You cannot dispute the fact that he's achieved a lot in his short life by this point. That anger and that hostility has driven him. That intensity, that passion has driven him. But it hasn't achieved what he hoped to achieve. And it would never achieve what he hoped to achieve. And if he hadn't undergone the second conversion, and entered into this third dispensation, he never would have become a martyr for a cause. He never would have had the potential to achieve what he hoped to achieve. That second conversion had to take place. It hasn't happened yet, but it's coming. So we're right in the thick of his heyday, where he's running around raising Cain, raising the profile of the Nation of Islam, raising his own profile, bringing in converts by the thousands, bringing in money. We'll get into that in episode 3. If you didn't know history, if you didn't know what was coming next, you'd think, boy, this guy, he might be president someday. He might be a revolutionary leader of some sort, probably more leaning to the latter than the former. But anyway, we'll get to all that. I have a hard time sometimes summing it all up because I know what's coming, and I want to give you a sneak preview, but let's just keep it at that. So episode 1 was about his childhood and the roots, why he converted to Islam and why he took to it like he did. Episode 2 was about his rhetoric and how it all came from that same place of anger and hostility emanating from what happened to him as a child, and how white America was starting to be able to exploit that, manipulate that for their own purposes, just to discredit the whole movement, discredit Martin Luther King, and how eventually this is going to lead to a split between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. We'll get to that later. Until then, I hope everybody enjoyed this episode. Until next time, God bless. Thank you.